Hello, welcome to Rappler Talk. Joining us is a leading statistician in the Philippines and a senior research fellow at the Philippine Institute of Development Studies, a government think tank. We're going to talk about pre-election surveys, quite a timely subject. So we're happy to welcome Dr. Jose Ramon Albert, but we call him Toots. So welcome to Rappler Talk. And I forgot to mention that till today, Professor Albert teaches at the AIM as well as in De La Salle. Welcome to Rappler Talk, Toots.
Thank you,
Can
Marites.
I call you that?
Yes, of course. I always tell people, like, if you want to remember me, just think of a tooth and then replace it with an S.
Okay, not tooth decay.
Yeah,
okay.
Hopefully not.
So, since you've been following surveys and you're one of the leading statisticians, in fact, you headed the government statistical board a few years ago. Can you maybe advise the public and even the media, how should we regard surveys, pre-election surveys?
Well, essentially, a survey is, because it's a sample, like even sipping your cup of coffee. You don't need to finish the entire cup to be able to determine if the coffee is good. So surveys are based on samples, but they still carry information. And I keep telling people, even when you go to the hospital, the doctors don't extract all your blood to be able to find out if you're sick, right? I mean, they just get a blood sample. So essentially, the whole issue is whether or not what the sample is the sample representative enough.
But how would the public know? We just need to trust the polling outfits.
Well, of course, there are different kinds of polling organizations.
Okay.
We do have some that have been fairly known and they have built their reputation over the years. And I think that's probably one of the things that you might want to judge, the track record. Each institution has had experience with polls, and the ones which have had a fairly good success story, in a way, when you're starting to think of pre-election surveys, if the reality is people's attitudes on who they're going to vote for, their selection, they're kind of fickle. I mean, it's a snapshot every time the surveys are done. But if there are certain leading organizations that have been able to fairly predict, well enough, even a month before. My sense is, in fact, even a month before, they're able to already know who the winners are.
I think you wrote for Rappler a few years back. You cited two leading or credible poll outfits as SWS and Pulse Asia. And the difference is that they have maybe the way they frame the questions, but they are both credible. But what questions should we ask these credible polling outfits when they present their surveys?
Well, in the first place, every time we're thinking along, asking survey organizations, they should be transparent enough to say how they collected their data. Typically, though, SWS and Pulse Asia, they do have their methodologies fairly well described and written in their websites and disseminated at that. And so it's just a matter of these institutions explaining to the public how exactly they collected their data. Now, people tend to be confused. How come only about 1,000 would be able to represent the entire population? Even in a regular statistics course, we're actually told that when you could actually compute sample sizes. So if you're estimating a proportion, like an approval rating, the proportion that's going to vote for a particular candidate, it could be readily calculated that you just need around 1,100 actually to be able to estimate within 3 percentage points with 95% confidence.
Like out of 100 million Filipinos.
Whether it's 100 million or 1 million or even 100,000, error of sort of might not be able to capture these differences. So that's why, in fact, some of the organizations like Pulse Asia, for instance, or even I think SWS, when they present information as far as ranks, they also put that into consideration, because it's possible that even if you say 20% will vote, it may be 20% plus minus 3 percentage points.
Yes, and they say that the respondents come from Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, but how would we know whether these respondents are not concentrated in one specific town or city in the Visayas, that they're fairly distributed?
Well, the thing is, that's why you have to really discover how exactly they collected their data. But as far as I understand from both organizations, what they do is, imagine that you divide the Philippines into 4 areas. Metro Manila alone, Balance Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So regardless of how the populations are distributed in these areas, the whole point is that you're going to get about 300 or so respondents per distinct area. So it doesn't really matter because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get a national reading.
Yes, yes.
So whether you're and of course sometimes occasionally they do break it down by areas, by socioeconomic groups, but they're really giving a national reading. So, which is going to be important because at the end of the day, it's the percentage of people in the country which will matter.
I was just thinking because, for example, in Luzon, if the preponderance, if most of the respondents come from, let's say, Ilocos, then they will favor the candidate from Ilocos. But it doesn't really work that way.
Actually, no. I mean, as far as I understand it, what they do is they try to spread it around in the entire Balance Luzon. So. If I recall right, even SWS tries to make sure that they try to have areas even across provinces, if I recall right. So, but the whole idea is, if you imagine polling stations spread throughout the country, and each of the polling stations represents a certain number of people who are going to vote. So that's how they more or less sample. They try to get random samples across those entire areas.
So for journalists, it's still, shall we say, fair to ask these questions?
Of course. I mean, you do need to ask those questions, and you need to also ask who's paying for it. Because, I mean, the reality is it may be possible that, although, of course, I would think that, I hope these organizations would be transparent enough to actually say whether this particular poll was paid for by so-and-so person, because that way we can really hold them accountable.
There have been instances when surveys were leaked, but conducted by reputable outfit like SWS. Rappler doesn't report leaked surveys because we're very careful. But these are commissioned surveys. Are commissioned surveys tainted?
Well, if the organization wants to protect its integrity, then these commissioned surveys would still have the same value. The only thing is, I think the commissioned surveys, once a person, an institution commissions a survey to whether SWS or Pulse Asia, although I don't speak for them,
yes.
Though technically I think I was voted as a fellow also of SWS. I have to disclose that. But it doesn't. That they don't pay me, by the way. How I wish they would. I wish they would, but they don't. But anyways, as far as I understand it, when surveys are commissioned, what happens is that it's possible that the person or institution that commissions the survey would not want to have it shown because precisely the results may not be favorable to them. However, if the results are favorable to them, then they want to show the public, you know. So in a way, it's their call.
I see. So should polling outfits disclose that? Eventually, they have to admit whether they did the surveys, and they should disclose that they indeed conducted the surveys and they were paid for by this party.
Yes, as far as I understand it, both SWS and Pulse Asia, I cannot speak for the other organizations, because you know there are so many organizations now that are actually doing. I mean, you can make a lot of money actually from all of these polls, but that's the whole point. I mean, whether the organizations are fairly reputable or whether or not the organizations are fly-by-night.
Does the number of days matter in the conduct of a survey? Because we saw a leaked survey saying it took 4 days to do the survey, and a regular survey saying it took 7 days. Does this really matter?
Well, these days, I mean, to be fair, you were able to capture information much faster. Unlike before, we still do I think many of these organizations would still do a lot of face-to-face interviews, but it's possible now that it's much faster to actually collect data. So I would think that whether it's 7 days or 4 days, I would think it's possible for them to actually conduct this within this period.
And my sense also is that polling outfits will not risk their reputation.
Exactly, that's the whole point. If you already have a very good reputation over the years that you built, and then all of a sudden you're going to try to taint it just because of a few millions that you were given, I don't think so. I mean, so most of these organizations that have been, very well known, not that I'm not defending them, but as far as I understand, they're not they do also want to make sure that their reputation continues.
And you in an article you wrote for Rappler a few years back, you talked about the bandwagon effect that that surveys can have, as well as there's also the underdog effect. So do surveys influence voters? And we want to be with the victorious people.
The reality is, this is information, So it's going to affect us somehow, but the question is to what extent will be the effect. It could be positive or negative, or it could actually be neutral. So what eventually matters is how that information is going to affect each of us. In some cases, I would imagine if there are certain things that are risky and you want to jump ship, so you might say, okay, I'd rather put my vote somewhere else. So that extra information might help you. Extra information may actually condition to that extent. However, that being said, it's pretty much the same thing as having advertisements, on television or even in Rappler or whatever, where you have information being provided to people and helping them make decisions on whether or not they should shift their choices.
So just because surveys are published and, some may be influenced by it, it doesn't denigrate the importance of surveys.
Actually, it's going to be important. I would think that it's, in fact, as far as I understand, the Supreme Court has made it clear that this is part of the freedom of speech and freedom of information.
And should we also know, or at least ask these polling outfits, how many of their respondents decided not to say yes to the interviews? There's such a thing as a rejection rate?
Yeah, non-response rates.
Non-response,
yes.
Is that important?
Well, in the Philippines, household surveys tend to have very high response rates, or in other words, low non-response rates. As far as I understand, it's just around 5%. So while certainly it's possible that some people, the non-respondents, what we do every time we're doing surveys is we tend to re-weight accordingly, and we balance out the weights of those who did not respond. But that's under the assumption that you can impute, in other words, you can guess the information of the non-respondents from those of you who did respond to your survey, which may be questionable to some extent. For instance, in the US, there have been issues on why polls have done a bad job actually predicting the outcomes. But that's partly an issue of non-response, but that's also partly an issue of how many people actually come out to vote during election day. In the US, I think less than 50%, a very big number, do not actually go to the polls. So when you're asking people who are you likely going to vote, it assumes they are going to vote, but it's still a big question whether or not they're actually going to the polls.
So in the US, the polls failed to forecast the outcome of the 2010, was it? No, 2016 elections.
Well, the thing is, I think we have to also understand that the polls, well, the US is a bit strange in the sense that they have an electoral college. Whoever wins it's not a question of how many total votes did they get. If you're going to think of the actual proportion of people who voted for Hillary Clinton, because it seems that was the prediction that she was going to win.
Yes.
She did actually
Yes.
get the number of
The
votes,
popular
the
vote.
popular vote, but she just didn't win because there's a difference between the popular votes and the electoral college. So Trump was, in a way, very cunning enough to actually use the information from surveys to be able to have a good strategy to pinpoint where he's strongest and to try to maximize his way of winning.
Has that ever happened in your knowledge here in Philippine electoral history where the polls were really off their mark, where they not predicted, but the survey showed that these candidates were going to win, yet, you know?
Well, none so far except for the case. There was a case of SWS trying to do a very large scale, I think 10,000 households to be surveyed, because if you remember, there was a very tight race between Fernando Po Jr. and Gloria Arroyo. And during that time, I think it was 2004, they did still predict rightly that Gloria Arroyo would win, and of course some people would suggest, it was a questionable election, but the thing is, the surveys suggested that she would be picking up a bigger proportion of votes than Fernando Po Jr. And it did happen that at least Gloria Arroyo was proclaimed winner. Only thing is there was a discrepancy in the actual percentage. So that was the only time that I could think of that but in a way when you start looking back, because I was part of an expert committee that actually investigated what was the main reason behind this discrepancy, and we figured out, because at the time SWS was, as I said, trying to get 10,000 respondents by 8 o'clock in the evening, but it was raining at that time.
Was that the exit poll?
Yes, it was an exit poll. And so what happened was they had fewer than what was expected. I think they only managed to get around 4,000 out of the 10,000. So in a way, that was the issue about non-response. Yes. So if you're not able to capture the people, and you're thinking that those who responded would be behaving just like the rest of the ones who did not respond, then there might be an issue.
I see. So now it's clear to me that we have low non-response rates in the Philippines, but that's not typical. I mean, for other countries like maybe the US or that do polling, is this are we one of the lowest, the countries with the lowest response rate?
The lowest non-response
non-response
rate.
Yes. Rate, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it has to do with the fact that we're not in a very advanced economy yet, and people tend to like to answer surveys, and this is true here in many developing countries, at least for household surveys, and also in communist or countries where they're supposed to answer surveys. But in very advanced economies, as far as I understand, non-response rates tend to be much larger.
I see. They don't have time for it. They're not interested.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I can remember even when I was a graduate student myself in New York, and I would be receiving phone calls, surveys. As soon as I get those, I would just put down the phone, Yeah. So can you imagine? I'm already a statistician, and I wasn't putting much attention to these kinds of polls, But sometimes it's the fact that the people don't have as much appreciation because of time. Getting to answer a survey, you do have opportunity losses.
I see. And here, maybe this is more detailed, not specific question to surveys. Recently, we saw in the latest survey of Pulse Asia the rise of a senatorial candidate from number 15 to number 3. I'm referring to Bongo. And this is spectacular. But is this statistically
possible?
Possible.
Well, anything's possible. I mean, people move up and down. I mean, just like if someone goes up, someone goes down. Pretty much. The question is whether or not, how was he able to manage to do that? I would think that, just basing, if you drive around the country, you realize why. I mean, he has a very good campaign strategy. I mean, his face is plastered all over the country. So naturally, you'll be expecting a very good rating for him.
So it's quite, has this happened before? I'm trying to recall if there was any candidate who was not really known before he declared his candidacy and then rose to the top. I can't seem to...
Well, I mean, for me, I could think of many, quite a number. Even Duterte initially was actually low. I mean, it was initially Binay who was leading in the polls, then it was Grace Poe, and then all of a sudden he went up, you know. So there, you know, people go, as I said, go up and down, and it's a question of dynamics, partly because, again, of extra information and people getting to know the candidates a little bit more. And I would think that essentially, you know, people's. I mean, people are a bit fickle also. I mean, we make changes in our choices, partly from whatever we hear, issues being thrown at candidates. So it happens that we do shift attention from one candidate to another. It's, I mean, I can even remember the former senator, well, he's the late Senator Angara. He wasn't doing well in the polls initially. And as far as I know, he actually used the polls to have even a more effective campaign strategy, and he won. So it can happen.
Yeah. And here in the Philippines, we do face-to-face interviews. We have never done phone interviews or maybe using mobile phones. That's not yet happening here.
Not yet, partly because the coverage rates, the proportion of people who actually have a mobile phone or even a landline is fairly low. Of course, the proportion having a mobile now has increased considerably to about 70%, but that means 30% don't have one. So how can you then give a voice to the 30%?
I see.
So but in other countries, however, where you can use, in fact, if I recall right, the leading survey organizations in the US, they actually use the telephone as a way to actually contact people. Partly because everybody has a phone. I mean, so it's really the question is whether or not people have access to a telephone, so that can be a way by which you could use the telephone. But there are risks because every time you're using a telephone, you don't see the person who is interviewing you, so there is a likely a bigger non-response rate for those kinds of telephone surveys as against face-to-face. Face-to-face because the contact with the person, I mean, it's kind of hard if somebody's going to see you face-to-face and you say, no, I have no time, you know.
But do you see that happening maybe in the future?
I would say that, it all depends really on whether or not, we're going to have a much wider coverage of people with mobiles especially. But the harder part is how do you design it, because right now we still have prepaid and postpaid, and we don't have a full list of the entire population of subscribers. So so unless our telcos are cooperating and we actually have a way of getting what's known as a frame, a list of all the subscribers from which you sample, so that's it will be kind of difficult to actually use it.
But that's not covered by privacy. I mean, like survey companies can get...
In theory, it's not, except that I think they don't cooperate with each other. and I don't think they make information even available to our regulators. I mean, I may be wrong, but that's how I understand it.
So maybe one last question, Dr. Albert. Does the political climate or maybe a climate of fear or intimidation affect the quality of responses? Natatakot ba yung mga taong hindi sumagot ng no or dapat sasagot sila ng yes kung takot sila? Like, do you favor or do you approve of government's program or of the president?
Well, to be quite honest, I think that's just an interpretation of people about why, because I think some people are surprised that the president continues to have a very good approval rating, and they start to think that maybe people are afraid, etc., etc. But I mean, to be fair to the president, I mean, I think all presidents, for that matter, have had very good satisfaction ratings. including the ones who are not that very popular. Partly because we Filipinos tend to be very nice to our leaders. And the only times we don't get to be nice is towards the next election, maybe 1 or 2 years when the term is about to end. Then we start making them account for what they did and they did not do, and that's when essentially we get maybe in a way a better reading of the popularity of our leaders. But right now it's still. It's been the case for both the current president and also even the immediate past president, where even up to the middle of their term, they had very good approval ratings. And I think to be fair, hindi ko po iniisip na nakaka-impluwensya yung takot sa survey kasi essentially hindi naman i-report directly yun sa mabait lang siguro tayo mag-rate sa ating sa ating pangulo at sa ating lahat ng mga leader ng ating bansa.
So basically nga you were saying, even before the interview you said even when you ask Filipinos to assess training programs, they usually give positive responses.
Absolutely. I mean, if you go to any training program, people will say, okay, give an evaluation. And people will, even actually in school, if you evaluate your teachers, you tend to give them very good marks. Even the terror teachers, we tend to still rate them very highly.
Okay, so, but still, surveys have uses.
Absolutely.
And we should regard them, should we be critical about them, not just accepting surveys, because we have to also ask questions. But generally, there have been at least the two polling outfits, SWS and Pulse, have had good track records.
Absolutely. I mean, I think all of this information helps us somehow get to see the current landscape. So the question is whether if you're dissatisfied that many people are going to vote for a particular candidate, the question is what are you going to do? So are you going to just sit in your corner and accept the situation as is, or are you going to get out and actually help other people, convince them to vote otherwise for candidates you don't like, or to vote for the candidates that you do like?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Albert. And on that note, we'd like to thank. We should do something, right? To vote or not, to campaign or not for journalists.
Not for journalists and not for people in government.
For both of us.
Right. Although during election day, we do have to make our choices too.
Yes. Okay, thanks again. And please listen to upcoming Rappler Talks. We will continue to focus on election issues. Thank you and good day.